Will the birds and the bees survive? Would your children lie to see Mother Nature sigh? Welcome to Smart Health Talk with your host, Elaine McFadden.
Welcome, everybody, to Smart Health Talk. And as usual, we have the most exciting show that you could possibly ask for in store for you today. And, you know, what does Smart Health Talk bring you? We bring you, like, the top people in the country on the issues that people are talking about, the issues that people are asking questions about and wondering, you know, is this safe for my family? Is this safe for my health? And, you know, people are asking these questions, and this has just been a crazy week because we have seen so many new things coming out. You know, it's been a learning experience for me. I've had an opportunity to spend some time talking with Dr. Michael Hanson, who is one of our guests today, and he is the senior scientist over at the Consumers Report magazine, and he is an international expert on pesticides, GMOs, and, you know, basically what's going on with our food. Has been studying this for over 25 years. We couldn't ask for a more knowledgeable guest on this subject, and he is going to be getting us up to date on what's going on with these foods, the new things that are coming out, that they're going to start pretty much stuffing down our throat is the way I look at it. And then we have one of my heroes out there besides Dr. Hanson, and that's Kate Webb, and she is the representative that helped introduce the GMO labeling bill over in Vermont. And this bill has really been made some progress thanks to all of the great people over in Vermont and all of their efforts and enthusiasm. And so Kate is going to give us an update on where Vermont is with their bill, what are the next steps that are going to be happening, how good is all this looking. And so this should be really fascinating to find out. And all three of us are going to be on the show for the entire hour here together, and I think it's going to be quite a learning experience with all these brilliant minds on the show here at the same time. So I'd like to just take a moment to welcome my two guests, Dr. Michael Hanson and Kate Webb, who's Vermont representative. So welcome to our show.
Thank you.
Nice to be on.
Well, so do you two, have you guys, you know, spent any time together at all?
We met in the speaker's office at the State House, and I was able to hear part of Dr. Hanson's testimony to the House Agriculture Committee, and it was very effective.
Isn't he wonderful? I tell you.
Well, when they give you an hour and a half to talk, and so I did a 75-minute presentation because I had a meeting with the Speaker of the House that had to happen as well.
So, well, why don't we just get into this? And because I know that people that are tuned in, this is something that they're all really interested in, because so many of us have been out fighting the fight, trying to educate people, trying to get the votes, trying to get Prop 37 passed in California, which would be kind of the equivalent of it's 112, correct?
Yes, H112.
Okay. And I just think that we have like so much that we can learn from each other, because as you know, each state like takes this on, we can learn from each other and win this, because the overwhelming majority of the country just seems like that this is something that's really important to them. Isn't that what you're getting, Kate, from the people in your state?
Oh, absolutely. We get constant emails and calls and contacts, and I have many people asking what's happening. Is it going to move? And we're continuing to plug away.
Well, first of all, we had Dr. Hanson say that he just finished testifying to the Vermont Agriculture Committee, and I'm kind of curious on the kind of questions that they were asking you, What were you talking about during that 75 minutes?
Well, this was I did. This was in early February when we had the big snowstorm out here, so I was actually stuck in Vermont for the weekend, which is actually quite nice. I did like an hour and 15 minutes before the House Agriculture Committee, and then the following day did 40 minutes before the Senate Agricultural Committee. And I basically gave a PowerPoint presentation on what genetic engineering is, how it does raise safety issues, and the arguments for labeling. And you have to go through both the science, and then I let them know that internationally there's now been a global agreement that genetic engineering is different than conventional breeding, and there should be required safety assessment before these products are allowed on the market. This is a position that has been globally agreed upon and is consistent with obligations under the World Trade Organization. And we're one of the only developed countries that actually does not require these safety assessments. And so the reason that you have to have labeling is there's no way to tell if there would be no other way to tell if their adverse health impacts are being caused by these crops unless you had a way to track them, who's eaten them and who hasn't. And that's what you need labeling for. And in the parlance, in the international parlance at Codex, labeling serves as a risk management measure to deal with scientific uncertainty. So, two things that are important. Globally, there's been an agreement that genetic engineering is different from conventional breeding, and there should be required safety assessments. And then second, after an 18-year fight, we were able to get a document out of Codex that functionally says that countries are free to label engineered foods as they want, as long as they follow certain rules. But those rules are such that any country in the world could pass labeling requirements that are just as stringent or more stringent than the European Union, and they would be considered trade neutral.
Well, before I forget, I know that we're trying to solve this state by state, but what if we just passed a federal law? Would that be better than the state?
Well, ideally a federal law that, yes, but the feds have not been willing to do this for over 20 years. They have, in fact, admitted their original policy in 1992 was introduced by then Vice President Dan Quayle as a deregulatory initiative. It came out of the Council on Competitiveness, and it was actually introduced at a biotechnology industry organization gathering on May 29th of 1992. And almost 10 years later, in 2001, they put out a new proposal. It was the pre-market biotech notification proposal. And after a lot of behind-the-door sort of meetings with us, they admitted that genetic engineering was different from conventional breeding, and they said that they were going to start requiring data to be submitted to the agency because companies would have to notify them 120 days before they want to sell any engineered crops. Well, that second proposal that the FDA proposed in 2001, which basically said their original proposal was incorrect because the original proposal said there's no difference between genetic engineering and conventional breeding, and so therefore we'll treat the crops the same. So even though in 2001 the FDA functionally admitted what they did in 1992 was wrong, we're still under the FDA is still acting under the 1992 regulations. And if the feds don't act, then it's up to the states to take action, because actually some of our strongest laws that we have are ones where states such as California or Vermont or others would take action first, and then that would often spur the feds to finally take action.
Well, I think that there's some really important things that we should be getting out of what Dr. Hanson just said there. And I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, Dr. Hanson, would you mind hanging up and calling us back, because we're getting a little bit of an echo. And
okay.
And we want to hear you very clearly. So.
Yeah, this should. All right,
okay, and in the meantime, I'll be talking to Kate here too.
All right, thanks.
Thanks. Okay. What I think that was really important that Dr. Hanson said was the fact that, we can tell that these foods are different. We can test and determine, is this a GMO food or not, because we can detect the toxin in there. Is that something that you guys talk about, Kate?
Absolutely. That's actually a critical argument there. Of course, as you probably know, the biotech industry discredits some of the results of the studies that are coming out. They discredit them. They say that the samples are too small. They have all sorts of things that they say that those are actually not legitimate. Our committee right now has 2 binders full of testimony and studies related to health issues, both pro and con. And I took those 2 binders into the Judiciary Committee today to show them the work that had been done, because that will be one of the issues that will be important in our ability to prove that we have a legitimate state interest in moving this forward to get the labeling that we require.
Well, I would just like to take a second here to read a statement that just came out April 14th in the Maui News, and this was from Monsanto. Okay, everybody. Monsanto speaks. And I kind of feel like that right now, that I'm kind of like Monsanto with this microphone. But anyway, it says, for years, our seeds have helped farmers protect and grow their crops. Our newer innovations include corn plants better able to withstand drought and soybeans that produce an oil that is a source of heart-healthy omega-3 fatty acids. And recently there have been wild accusations about us with no basis in truth. And what you're saying is that you actually had a notebook full of stuff.
We have a notebook full of studies that we presented that show that, because, of course, the FDA is not required to do any testing when they in approving this drug. They just basically use the information that they get from the biotech industry to say that they're safe. So they don't have peer-reviewed studies. They don't have longitudinal studies. They just have word from the manufacturer that, hey, our stuff is totally safe. Some of this one study that may have been in France, Dr. Hanson would know this, that tried to replicate one of the longitudinal studies on rats, actually came up with some very different information showing that the rats, that there were considerably more tumors in the rats over a long-term basis. And the biotech industry said that those are not accurate because the samples were too small. So, they're doing what they have to do to discredit the little science that we do have, because, of course, they hold the patent on these products, and the ability to actually do some of the testing is quite difficult.
Well, that's exactly why we wanted to have Dr. Hanson on the show with us today, and it looks like he is calling back in, so we should be piping him back in. There he is. Welcome back. Welcome back.
Do I sound better now?
Yeah, I think I'm the one with the echo.
Oh.
So anyway, hopefully it's not too bad, but this is like the perfect time for you to call in, because we were just talking about the fact that, Kate has this, notebook full of all of these different research studies that are pointing to, there are potential risks associated with GMOs, but, like the scientists from Monsanto, or maybe even yourself, would say the sample sizes are too small, we can't necessarily trust this. Are these studies still telling us something, though? Are they kind of leading us down a path where they're sending us some clues that maybe we should be looking closer?
Well, what do you mean? It depends which studies you're talking about. There have been a number of labs that actually have done longer-term feeding studies and other studies that do suggest problems that need to be followed up on. I mean, I think that's very, very clear. And even with this most recent Seralini paper that found cancer, all the media attention to that focused on the fact that all these supposed scientists said that was a flawed study, the sample size was too small, and they used a type of rat that was susceptible to cancer. Well, the ironic thing about all that is what was hidden from all that media attention is that in the end, both the European Food Standard Agency and the French Food Standard Agency functionally agreed with Seralini. Because what they did is, first, the French Food Safety Agency, they came out and said, well, while this study doesn't cause us to change our conclusions about the safety of that Roundup Ready corn that they tested, they did say this is one of the first long-term feeding studies that was done with a genetically engineered crop that has its proprietary chemical actually applied to it. That is, these Roundup Ready crops, they're designed to be sprayed with Roundup. And so the seeds that should be tested should come from plants that have been sprayed with Roundup.
And weren't you just giving us a clue on an important piece of the puzzle that's missing here, and that's the labeling? Because, like you said, without the labeling, we cannot even do our own studies with our own doctors and our own people.
That's correct. That's why there's a lot of folks that don't like labeling, because they say, well, GMOs should be banned, and if you label them, you've already accepted the fact that they're going to be here. That's an argument you hear in many countries and also in parts of this country. And my response to that is fine. If you want to get the political power to ban something, more power to you. But the fact of the matter is this stuff is on the market right now, and the only way to, for people to be able to track things is we have to have labeling.
Well, and I'm actually looking at another study here that's saying that Monsanto claims to ditch herbicide while selling more of it. This is a Mother Jones article. Mother Jones article, and this. So again, we kind of go back to this statement from Monsanto that said, "Oh, they've been our savior for drought. That we're using less pesticide," but that's not really true.
That's correct. That is. The herbicide-tolerant crops do not use less pesticide. In fact, the data shows that because of increasing resistance in weeds, they're using more. The amount of glyphosate use has exploded. It's increased tenfold in the last 10 years. The number of weeds that are resistant to Roundup, now globally, there's 21 species. We have 14 of them in the United States. They've infested 60 million acres. Half the farmers in the country are dealing with this problem that was all created by these engineered crops. So there's so much glyphosate now being used, plants are becoming resistant to it, so the answer of the companies is, we'll just come in with now plants that are resistant not only to glyphosate, but also to 2,4-D or to dicamba and some of these other chlorophenoxy herbicides. Some of the older herbicides that were considered more toxic, and that was the reason that they were going to glyphosate in the first place.
And that's like toxic to us, and it's toxic to bees and the environment. And so isn't there like a price tag that really comes with that? I mean, are those the kind of things that you talk about, Kate? And especially did you actually testify to the Judicial Committee today? Or
Yes.
Oh, you did? Okay, well, tell us about that.
To give you an idea of just sort of where we are at this point, as Dr. Hanson knows, the bill was presented through the Agricultural Committee it was presented in January, and it was reviewed in February. And they collected a number of findings, and their job was basically to show whether or not the state had a legitimate state interest in this labeling. And they did this by demonstrating that they were able to collect enough information to show that there are significant health and safety issues that are legitimate state interest, that there are environmental concerns, that they're to prevent things like consumer confusion and deception, to create additional markets for non-certified organic, but foods that are not genetically engineered. And also another aspect was to protect religious and cultural practices. So they put together a number of findings to demonstrate, and if we could do this, we believe that will show that the state has a legitimate interest in this kind of labeling. The bill passed out of that committee on a vote of 8-3. It was then moved to the Judiciary Committee. They have been very busy, but they finally picked it up today. And their job is basically to see, they're looking at what the committee has done so far. And their job is basically to see if this is legally defensible. and we do believe it is legally defensible. We had the Attorney General's office in today, and of course they also have to look at the risk of litigation. I have to move to, Dr. Hanson can present all of the amazing background and common sense information as to why we need to do this. I have to organize it in such a way that it can be legally defensible, and that does not always mean that it's commonsensical.
And so what do you mean by that?
What I mean is everybody knows that you should have a right to know what you're eating. That it's common sense to say that you should have a right to know what you're eating and how it was produced. But because we have a complex collection of laws that put jurisdiction of certain things in the federal government and certain things with the state, we have to sort of work our way through what it is that we can actually regulate. And to do that, it's a very tricky task, because if you say it in the wrong way, you can knock the whole case out. And we do know that we will face litigation from the biotech industry. They so much as threatened that they would do that. So what we're trying to do right now is really put together a case that we believe is legally defensible and that we can win. We had very encouraging news come from Oregon that their legislative council, their preliminary ruling, this isn't official yet, they have, their preliminary ruling is that the genetic engineering is constitutional. And right now our Leg Council also believes that it is constitutional. So we will now bring in other people to help the Judiciary Committee see that it is constitutional. We can get through. There are 3 arguments that we have to get through to prove that we can win. And then, being legally defensible does not necessarily mean that you'll prevail. We heard today that it would cost the state about somewhere between $5 and $10 million is the amount of money that we would need to face this litigation. So that's another concern.
And the reason for that is because you know that Monsanto's taken you to court to challenge all this, because they fight tooth and nail all along the way, because this is how they make big money, everyone. They get a cut in every single food that we eat, and they want to cut in not just that, but all the animals as well, and not just that. They want trees, landscape plants. It's like you give them an inch and they'll just take everything.
And they spent $45 million in California.
Isn't that just so unbelievable? All that money. And I think I've had to deal with the poor and see hungry people. And when I think of all that money that could have went and fed all those people, it's being used to keep us from knowing what's in our food. And then it's not just them, but it's the companies with these brands that we've been so loyal to and been supporting them all these years. And then they're taking and turning our money against us in a way. That's the way it looks like to me. But I kind of want to ask, there was another study that I had here on, we've kind of been talking about the health impacts, but the environmental impacts are really big as well. And just looking at climate change and how, these fertilizers and these different chemicals used in this type of farming is, I'm looking right here at an article about how it's creating all these algae blooms and dead zones in the water. And
yeah, that's because of nitrogen pollution.
Yeah, well, people that see this, tell them what's happening, Dr. Hanson, because they probably see this in some of the waterways near their home, and
right. But that has to do with at least the algal blooms, and that are usually connected, and the dead zones that are, for example, in the at the end of the Mississippi and the Gulf Coast. That's because there's too much nutrients in the water, such as nitrogen and phosphorus. And what happens is then the algae use that, and their populations explode, and of course they take up oxygen, so they suck up all the oxygen out of the water. That's what makes it a dead zone, and that's because of basically industrial agricultural production, whether it's genetic engineered or not.
Right.
I wanted to go back and say for environmental impacts, there's both direct and indirect environmental impacts of engineered crops. There can be direct ones, for example, the fact that the engineered, that the Roundup Ready crops are all designed to be sprayed with glyphosate. That's a direct effect. But then you've got indirect effects because it turns out all these corn seeds that are coated with either for example, one of the biggest pests is the corn rootworm, right? There is a BT for that. It's BT 863. Well, as it turns out, all the corn seeds now are all coated. They're coated with the substance that actually contains a couple of fungicides and it contains a couple of insecticides, including these neonicotinoid insecticides that have been associated with colony collapse disorder with the kill-off of the bees, because it turns out that before we started planting engineered crops, we didn't actually coat all the corn seeds. We do now because, as it turns out, when the corn plant first germinates, the level of BT that's in it is not sufficient to protect it. It's only when it gets to a certain size. That's why all the corn seeds are coated with these pesticides. And so what you have is you go from an area that 15 years ago maybe 5 or 10% of the corn acreage had this. Now it's virtually 100%. So that huge exposure of insects to neonicotinoids that are coming from all these seeds is an indirect effect of the fact that they've been engineered.
And they're reacting to it because they want to survive.
That's correct. And then the other thing I would like to say is when I was up in Vermont, I did actually talk to a number of people from the Judiciary Committee and others because these laws have been crafted in such a way so they will not raise constitutional issues. What the constitutional issue is basically preemption. Mm-hmm. And that's why these laws are written in such a way that they don't require labeling of ingredients, because it is very clear from the National Labeling and Education Act, the NLEA, that the feds do preempt anything on ingredient labeling.
That's still confusing to me. And like when Kate was just talking earlier about the it being constitutional, in my mind I was wondering, okay, well, so like what does that mean? What's the importance of that? And you're saying it's this preempt.
Well, there's two things. There's the preemption, and I didn't want to get into the technical considerations there. Because there's First Amendment issues and then interstate commerce issues, and so it comes down to something called the Central Hudson test and this other factor. And the reason Vermont has been concerned, or their Attorney General, is they keep on pointing to this mandatory labeling law they had for RBGH, and that failed because they said mere consumer curiosity isn't enough. And it turns out that the problem with that Vermont law is they never said that there was any kind of difference between milk from treated and untreated cows. They didn't raise any of the safety issues. So they look at that court case, which came down in 1997, and what I told them, because their Attorney General hadn't looked at this, there was a court case in Ohio that went up to the 6th District Court that got determined in 2010, and there they said that you can label milk as, for example, RBGH-free because there are differences. The court disagreed with the FDA and said there are differences in milk from treated cows compared to untreated, and those include increased somatic cell counts, increased levels of IGF-1, which is related to a number of cancers, and then lower milk quality. So right there, the fact that there was increase in IGF-1, that is a potential safety issue, and that then would make it a compelling state interest. And so with genetic engineering, we know that there's scientific uncertainty because these crops are on the market without appropriate testing. So therefore, labeling is a risk management measure to deal with that scientific uncertainty. It's permitted internationally, and I think in this country, the way the law is written, it would not raise constitutional issues.
So how does that make you feel, Kate, when you're up there testifying for something that, you know, you hear all these different things on how it can affect people's health. You've talked to parents with children that have had, you know, allergy issues, all these different things. I mean, how does that feel when you get up and you testify in front of all those people, knowing all of these things that are at stake?
Well, I definitely know that, you know, that my job is today, for example, to really encourage the Judiciary Committee to feel the passion of what it is that we're trying to do here, and then equip them with the facts. So I sort of can't even have my feelings because
it's really based on facts and like Dr. Hanson saying, you know, just because, you know, we think this isn't right, we've got to really work with the laws. We've got to work with all these different things with the perimeters that we can work within, because otherwise we have no power.
Yep.
And the testimony that we had today from our legislative council and from our Attorney General's office was not as strong as Dr. Hanson was that we could win. So they did not present it in a way to the committee that was as strong as was just presented. And I think that, and what I was trying to remind the committee is, yes, of course, the Attorney General's office has to present this. They have to present the worst case. But you have to also remember what the worst case is on the other side, and that's that we don't label, and we continue to not know what it is that we're eating, and we continue to allow this to occur the way it's occurring.
Yeah, it's like if you saw
a grand
someone
experiment.
Well, if you saw
exactly.
someone getting hurt or in pain, I mean, you're just like, you know, what happened this past week in Boston. You know, people responded.
No. I think there's something that this is fundamentally different than Boston, because the issue here with these foods is not acute harm. It isn't like people are going to eat these and fall over dead tomorrow. If something like Boston were happening, we would see it. The problem with these crops is the longer term. People don't get sick right away, and that is the real concern, is the long-term health.
It's secretly eating away at us, and we don't even realize that that's happening. And Dr. Hanson and I were looking over another study that was brought to our attention that I thought was interesting. And first of all, it taught me a couple things, because in Europe, even with the labeling, they could still put, just like with trans fats or with organic, 95% of the products have to be...
No. That study that you were looking at was out of the Hong Kong Consumer Association, and the testing was actually done by the Food Standard Authority in Hong Kong, part of the government. And so that stuff that they were referring to, that's the law in Hong Kong, not in Europe.
Oh, in Hong Kong. Okay, but
in Hong Kong, you can labeling kicks in. Required labeling is if there's more than 5% of the product is engineered, then it has to be labeled. And I guess there in Hong Kong, if it's less than 5%, you can label it GMO free. In Europe, the criteria for labeling is if there's more than 0.9% of any ingredient is engineered, then that has to be labeled. If it's less than that, you can't label something in Europe as non-GMO, for example, if there's any detectable GM in it.
And we use that same standard in our bill.
Yeah.
The European one?
Yes.
Okay, well, yeah, I was kind of wondering about that, because it shows that you can actually set up the law in different ways. And so I was just wondering about that, because obviously we'd want to have it so the least amount of GMOs would be in there. But are you seeing a change in the attitude? Because you've been working on this for like a year, Kate. Are you starting to see a change in attitude even over the past year?
It's really exciting what's happening. It's really exciting what's happening here. Last year, Jerry Greenfield of Ben & Jerry's came into the Agricultural Committee and testified, and he said, yeah, you know what? We'll probably have to label, and that's okay. I'm willing to label. And this year, he came in and said that they're going to start to do some retooling. And not only that, bless his soul, they're starting to work with independent producers here to help them learn how to do the retooling so that they're not using genetically engineered products. We have our Lake Champlain chocolates. They are now going to be producing a genetically GE-free chocolate. So it's happening. So even if we don't get something out this year, things are happening all around us. I mean, the people are.
You just gave me goosebumps. You really did. You just gave me goosebumps, and like that hardly ever happens on my show. But to hear in your voice, what I just heard in your voice, it's bringing tears to my eyes. It's just like you fight for so long, because you want something better for people. You want them to not have to, just be forced to eat these foods, that they could actually have a choice. And what I was wondering, too, is that do you think that people are even getting more of a stronger attitude against GMOs where it's, they just don't want any part of it in their food, and they just as soon get rid of it altogether, where we don't even have a choice. It's like, why even put it in there?
Well, we definitely, we really care about our food up here in Vermont, as I know you do in California as well. But I think that for most people, they just want to have the right to know. They just want to have the right to know. And that's really
I want to get rid of it.
Yeah. Well, I stay away from it where I can, where I know. I don't buy that many packaged products.
Well, the reason I want to stay away from it completely is kind of the next thing I wanted to discuss with Dr. Hanson. And, I don't know if this is necessarily your expertise, but I think we do have some pretty strong studies out there that are showing that agriculture, we're looking at global warming, we're looking at all these different things happening to our planet. And agriculture actually has a lot of potential to help us counteract the effects of global warming by getting away from this industrial type of farming that's causing like some of the other problems that we mentioned earlier with the waterways and the algae blooms and all those kind of things, additional side effects. That agriculture has a lot of potential for helping us with global warming, and at the same time, we could like stop using all these pesticides and maybe have like some healthier food.
Right, but that's actually the larger fight for sustainable, or I would say ecologically rational agriculture, and that has been going on for decades. Things are getting better in an incremental way. The U.S., of course, it lags behind, but I think the fact that, 3 years ago we had the IAASTD, the International Assessment, the International Agricultural Assessment for the Role of Science and Technology in Development, and that was something similar to the International Panel on Climate Change, came up with this global treaty on the way forward for climate change. Well, a similar thing was done for agriculture with this IAASTD, and what happened is at the end of this process, there were 400 scientists, countries from all over the world, just like the IPCC, all these experts got together, and the report that they released, the U.S. and a lot of industry hated it, and they walked away from it. Why? Because it said the answer for agriculture is not technology. It's not more things like genetic engineering or nanotechnology, which is actually moving in. It's these ecologically rational forms of agriculture. It's moving back to some of these forms that are happening, and we are starting to see evidence come out, these studies come out showing that organic and other systems actually you can produce milk and meat and have less greenhouse gas emissions than industrial agriculture. And actually there was just a report out that they're making a big deal out of it, but I've known of it for quite a while, and that's actually in India. There are these very poor farmers in Bihar and elsewhere that have produced the highest rice levels in the world, higher than any that have been seen with modern technology, higher than Erie has come up with, and none of it's engineered, and none of it's using a lot of chemicals. It's this sustainable rice intensification system, and it's all pretty much organic. So there are a lot of farmers' organizations, peasant organizations all over the world who actually have been pointing out in the fora where climate change is being talked about that agriculture is an important component of it, particularly more traditional forms of agriculture that are more ecologically rational, and these organic agriculture and those things. So you have a whole set of people that are trying to fight to preserve their way of life, and now we have some of the science that is starting to show that, for example, that organic systems where crops are rotated are actually, they have much less greenhouse gas emissions these more conventional systems.
So you can even get to the level of the difference in cow burps. That's actually another issue. And one of the things that we definitely try to do here, that my husband and I try to do, is the meats that we eat, we try to find the ones that are actually grass-fed as opposed to grain-fed. And probably Dr. Hanson can speak more to the nutritional value, but I believe that there are studies that show that just the cholesterol difference is much
not
better.
Not only that, grass-fed, all grass-fed animals, if the grass-fed and don't get any grains, the data is very clear. There is increased nutritional benefit in both the meat and milk. There is increased omega-3s, of course, because where that comes from is actually chlorophyll, and so fish eat a lot of algae. Well, ruminants and cows are designed to eat grass, not grain.
And meanwhile, we're feeding,
and you have the conjugated linolenic acids and the alpha tocopherols and these other fats that are considered the good fats. So they've demonstrated that these increases in the meat and milk, and there's been a step further because there's been work in the Netherlands that have shown that nursing mothers that eat conventional meat versus grass-fed, you can see the difference in their breast milk too.
And that affects IQ.
And that is affecting the infant. So that means the quality of the breast milk, there's higher levels of omega-3s and CLAs. So it clearly shows eating that is superior. Now, in this country, you can't just go with organic because you can have, there's organic milk, for example, that comes from cows that are kept in the horizon cows out in, Oregon and Idaho in these giant farms. They have access to outdoors, but they're fed a bunch of organic grain. The grass-fed ones, yes, it is so clear-cut that grass-fed animals, clearly, their milk and meat is of higher nutritional quality than conventional, and it's to the point that Walter Willett and people at Harvard are now thinking that this connection of meat, red meat consumption, and cancer and things, that what that actually is about is a connection between eating meat that has been grain-fed as opposed to grass-fed.
And what about fish now? And what about fish now that we're feeding corn?
Well, exactly. That's the whole other thing. When you look
and chicken poop too.
Yes. When you look at, for example, wild salmon, when you look at the levels of omega-3s to omega-6s that they have, and you compare that to farm salmon have about one-third the level. So when you look at the 3 to 6s, it's for wild-caught fish, it's like 10.3 for wild salmon. For farm salmon, and I think it was 3.9.
What about the GMO salmon?
And then the GMO salmon was 3.6.
And so that GMO salmon, what about that in the environment?
Well,
that's just at a whole new level.
That creates all sorts of more problems. The environmental problems of those engineered salmon, they're primarily going to be seen up in Canada because that's where the eggs are being produced. And, of course, to produce eggs, you have to have fertile adults. And the Prince Edward Island where the eggs would be created used to be salmon habitat. Salmon used to naturally live there, so...
Well, and I actually contacted that island because I thought they should get rid of the GMOs off their island and go all organic for the whole island, but I don't think they listened to me. But I did try to tell them that.
Well, actually, there is a strong movement that's on Prince Edward Island. Actually,
there is.
Yes, there is.
Encouraging.
And in fact, who was just there for the last 2 days is legislators from Hawaii. From Alaska. Who've been pushing these both labeling bills and anti-GE fish bills. Yes, actually, some Alaska legislatures were just in Prince Edward Island talking to folks and others about this issue, literally in the last 2 days. So.
Well, that's awesome. And why don't we have a few minutes left, so why don't each of you kind of go over, Kate, why don't you start on, your game plan from here? So, you've gotten this far. Today you just finished testifying before the Judicial Committee.
Yes.
So
and I have to say that it was received extremely well.
Yay!
It was really, and one of the more conservative but very bright Republican lawyers asked some very good questions, and he really was very clear that, of course, people should have a right to know. And his questions were really, is it legally defensible, and how much is it going to cost? And we should be able to answer those questions to the best of our ability. And another person on the committee who is also very bright, I could see his mind flipping through on how to be able to reduce the likelihood of the impact of a potential lawsuit. I would expect that right now they took testimony today. They will be facing the Death with Dignity bill starting next week, so they're going to be pretty immersed with that. I would expect that they should be able to come back to the bill the following week. Our hope is that it's going to get out of the House by the end of our session and over to the Senate. If it doesn't get over to the Senate in May, we have some pretty substantial promises that it will travel in January. In addition, our governor, who last year was not interested in this bill, spoke up in favor of it. So that's another really good... Excuse me?
Just recently?
Just recently, like maybe 2 weeks. Yeah, that's due, and that's really
Dr.
important.
Hanson, you got through. Between you and Kate.
No, they were actually trying to engineer a meeting because it turns out that I'll just say there's another person who's anti-GE, who's a scientist who's been very critical of this, who's married to someone who used to babysit the governor.
We're such a small state.
No, everybody knows everybody.
I know. So they were trying to get a meeting with that person and myself and this other scientist to meet with the governor and the person who runs the public health program. But it sounds like that hasn't happened. But it sounds like that might not be needed because the government's been persuaded enough, which is good.
And Dr. Hanson, your name came up several times. We may be asking again for you to come and speak to the Judiciary Committee. So
no problem.
Keep the phone near.
I'll be more than happy to do that. Because
Terrific.
Vermont, during the fights in the early 90s on bovine growth hormone, we had 10 states. I testified and went to all of them. Vermont got it through. And a lot of it was the people that were on those committees. I will say that women were some of the strongest ones, because when I first went up there and testified, people had no idea, particularly the men, had no idea about this RBGH. And when I talked about mastitis and it's a painful thing for the cows, they didn't get it. But every woman that were on those hearings, when they heard me talk about mastitis, they knew exactly what.
Well, that's good. That means women were breastfeeding.
No, so people laugh, but those were the strong ones. They got it, and that's in part why that bill went through. And I thought was very funny is that some of the same people. Bobby Starr was there for the RBGH ones, had been very critical. He was much less this time. He listened and much more reasonable. So.
And he's now head of the ag in the Senate, so we'll see what happens with that. But there's a very strong voice in the Senate, and the Senate pro tem is prepared to take it up. So we have there's a lot of timing going on here. There's also a lot of political will, and we just have to deal with that fear. And this is when I bring out the picture of David and Goliath.
Yeah, and one final thing that I would like to say, I would also like to echo what Kate says. As someone who has worked on these issues for 25 years in the national, in the international, and then here, I do see the tide appears to be changing between Vermont and Connecticut and Washington State. Maine is going to have their hearing next Wednesday. I'll go up for that. I just got an email today from Illinois about their hearings. So I do think that between one of these states that labeling bills will probably go through. One of those states, if they don't, things are looking very strong actually in Washington as well.
Well, I just want to thank you both for all your work and all your efforts. And I think, Dr. Hanson, you've been out there doing this for us for 25 years. You deserve a really big thank you. Because, look, it's, obviously not giving up and perseverance pays off. And I think that's what everyone that's been involved in this, we were a little disappointed, with our Prop 37 and everything. But then we saw that the awareness level had increased so much and the enthusiasm really started to pick up that we saw that it was all worth it in the end. And then, we see what other states like Vermont, and you have made the commitment, too, that I guess when other states follow you, that's even going to speed up your progress even faster.
And it's not a matter of if. It's really just a matter of when. It's going to happen. And it may eventually finally happen at the federal level. But when my conversation with our representative, he said, forget the Congress.
Yeah, exactly. This present Congress, that's true. 2 days after Boston, they can't even pass background checks?
In the Senate.
Yes, in the Senate or muzzle capacities. Come on.
But, we're getting all the work.
That's the rational side.
Well, at least, all this stuff's getting done now. So when everything else gets in place, then hopefully we'll really be able to get some stuff done and clean up our food and make it healthier, because I think that's the motivation of all of us.
That's correct.
Is that, we care about people. We care about everyone out there that's listening to this program, and I hope that you will, keep track on what's going on. We'll definitely be putting updates on our Facebook page, Smart Health Talk, and our website, and Pinterest and all that stuff. We do it all because we want to get the word out as much as possible. And we'll be putting this interview up, so if you want to share it with your friends and let them know about it, I would highly recommend that they use this as a teaching tool to recommend other people. Because look at, I was so excited to have Dr. Hanson and Kate on the show, because they're not just like people that I have all this respect for, but they're role models for the rest of us. And I just want to thank you both so much for joining us today and all your work. And hopefully we'll be talking again with some celebration.
Yes, I'll keep you posted.
Thank you so much, Kate, everybody. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Stay healthy, everyone. Bye, Dr. Hanson.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Sign me up now, make sure you use your smart. Take a walk on.
You're on board KCAA's Inland Talk Express. KCAA, Loma Linda, 1050 AM, the station that leaves no listener behind.
Be sure to visit our website at smarthealthtalk.com.
This is NBC News Radio.